Carving the trenches around the obelisk alone would have taken 130 men an entire year. Yet, to speed up the process, the workers probably took advantage of natural weathering and cracks.
Then, with ropes, it had to be pulled on a ramp that would be built out of mud brick until the banks of the Nile. Then it would be put on huge barges that would transport these obelisks down the Nile to Luxor, or even further down to nowadays Cairo.
The finished obelisks are loaded onto transport ships up to 80 meters long, and then towed down the Nile by rowboats from Aswan to Thebes. Once on site, they're pulled via ramps. Then the teams let them slide into a foundation filled with sand. In later times, the monumental stone needles are popular spoils of conquest throughout Europe. The ancient Romans, Napoleon Bonaparte and the British, they all used obelisks from Egypt to add some of the splendor of the Pharaonic Empire to their own capitals. Even the Washington Monument is basically nothing more than the modern interpretation of the ancient obelisks. Splendor and glory on the Nile. Every pharaoh sees it as his duty to enlarge and embellish the Egyptian temples. Thus, more and more impressive buildings are erected around Thebes, like Karnak, the largest of all preserved temples. "134 columns once supported its wooden roof, a true forest of stones. "24 meters high, 104 meters long, and 52 meters wide, the Great Hall of Columns is a building of superlatives. Almost 1,000 years will pass before other civilizations match these achievements of the Pharaonic Empire. The stone temples of Thebes have survived the millennia. Even if nothing remains of the ancient adobe buildings, researchers today can draw an amazingly accurate picture of the city. Its residential areas lie on the eastern bank of the Nile. To protect their inhabitants from the heat, most of the houses have few windows, as is common in traditional North African buildings until modern times. Beyond the alleys of plain mud brick houses are the villas of priests and officials. The everyday life of this rich upper class can be reconstructed by numerous archaeological finds. The furnishings of their houses are luxurious and comfortable. Wooden chairs with backrests can be afforded only by the nobility and high officials. There are bathrooms with stone toilets. Below the opening, a vessel filled with sand, which was emptied regularly. The remains of an ancient Egyptian shower, a small room with a recessed limestone slab and a water drain. There's even evidence of leisure activities. Stick fencing seems to have been a popular pastime, as well as senet, a precursor of backgammon.
The upper classes did, no doubt, enjoy certain luxuries that lower classes didn't. I think there was a big divide between the very wealthy and the very poor, but I don't think ancient Egypt could have worked as a culture, society, and a civilization if the elite had been totally separate from the common people. I think Egypt was organized by households. You owed labor to your lord, but your lord owed you security, sustenance, food, and protection. The lower classes and the upper classes were more interdigitated or more embedded than we might think if we just use the term upper class or elite.
the mask is a very good idea, because there's all sorts of things floating around in the atmosphere in here, not just the dust of ages, but the dust of human beings. And as such, we have to be very, very respectful.
It's a large rock-cut tomb, and although its walls are unfinished, it's typical of those created for courtiers and officials throughout these cliffs.
Wow, it's a mummified body. It's absolutely incredible. Oh, that's quite something. And if you look along the length of this very long tomb, look at the floor. This isn't stone. These are human remains and mummy wrappings. And there are chambers and corridors leading off, again full of wrappings, the linen of ages.
Some of it is claimed to be the very linen that bound the bodies of Montahotep's warriors to help preserve them for eternity. But at first glance, it's hard to get a clear picture. For this particular tomb seems to have been reused many times during Egypt's long history.
Part of a shoulder. You see the way the skin's folded and dried out. Partial human body, still with much of its soft tissue intact. It hits you immediately in the face and you're confronted with what a tomb is all about. Make no mistake, this is the home of the dead and we're in amongst them. It's a very, very emotive and powerful place to be.
But what's striking is how little is left of their bodies. Like many other tombs up and down the Nile, they've been subjected to centuries of looting and damage.
And amongst all these linen wrappings and debris and the human remains themselves are the tangible remains of these men who died so bravely in their efforts to reunify Egypt for Montahotep, their leader. Having just come out of that tomb, I have very, very mixed emotions. I don't really know what I was expecting to see. Certainly some of Montahotep's soldiers. Perhaps some of them were, it's highly likely. Essentially, what we're looking at are the ancient Egyptians themselves. These are the ancient Egyptians. Temples, tombs, pyramids, this wonderful culture. It's all well and good studying these esoteric aspects that are distinct and marvellous and grand, but when it comes down to it, the things we should really be interested in are these people.
Montahotep's reunification of Egypt marked a new beginning, the dawn of what would become known as the Middle Kingdom. And the rise of Thebes. Montahotep made it the new spiritual heart of Egypt. And it would stay that way for the next 2,000 years. But whereas the war god Montu had dominated the previous century of Egypt's story, the deity that now took centre stage was Hathor, the goddess of love, joy, beauty, and motherhood.
A prominent figure during that time, called Hemayunu, was the vizier during the reign of Khufu in the 4th dynasty, and one of the king's relatives. He was in charge of building his Great Pyramid, and keeping an eye over its construction works, and he was buried near Khufu's pyramid. The construction work of the pyramid was done by expert and unskilled laborers employed by the state for the job. These employees either offered to pay off a debt, performed community service, or were paid for their time. The annual inundation of the Nile River was important for Egyptian survival because it distributed rich soil from the riverbank all across the shore's farmlands. However, it also made farming those lands impossible during the flood. During these times, the government supplied work for farms by constructing large monuments. These were the individuals who performed the real physical labor of moving stones, elevating obelisks, constructing temples, and constructing the pyramids that continue to amaze and motivate people today. Khufu was replaced by a family member outside the legal line called Jedefra after his death. Jedefra was Khufu's son, but he did not appear to be his designated heir. Some scholars believe Jedefra built the Great Sphinx of Giza, while others believe Khafre, his sibling and successor, built it. The Sphinx is the world's biggest monolithic monument, showing a recumbent lion's torso with a king's head and visage. Historically, this king's visage has been identified as Khafre's, but Dobrev and others believe it's Khufu's. It appears to have been constructed by Khafre because it is exactly in line with his pyramid complex, and the Sphinx's face resembles Khafre more than Khufu. Khafre's pyramid is the second largest in Giza, and his complex is almost as big as his father's. Little is known about his rule. According to Egyptian texts, he continued his father's policies and government model by concentrating power in the hands of his closest family members and exerting strict control over policies and laws. Following Khafre's demise, succession was temporarily disrupted again when Baka, Jedefri's son, took the throne. He did not even rule for a year before Menkaure, Khafre's son, took over as monarch. Both the Greeks and the Egyptian writings praise Menkaure. Menkaure, like his father and grandpa before him, started construction on his Giza pyramid and shrine complex. Menkaure's pyramid and complex are smaller than the other two, which represent a significant development in the history of the Old Kingdom, and one of the causes of its collapse. The resources required to construct the Great Pyramid were no longer accessible during Menkaure's period, but he did his best to establish an everlasting residence on par with his fathers and grandfathers. Quenra, Menkaure's son and designated successor, perished while this pyramid was being constructed, upsetting the dynastic succession, and Menkaure died before the pyramid complex was finished. Despite reigning for 30 years, he was unable to finish the work of his predecessors, which many historians attribute to the dwindling resources at his disposal. Shepseskaf, Menkaure's successor, finished Menkaure's structure at Giza, but was buried in a relatively modest mastaba at Saqqara. As previously stated, the monarchs diverted immense resources to their funerary structures and buildings, but these temples and sanctuaries were increasingly under the authority of the priests who managed them, rather than the king. Although the Giza Plateau is now an old, sand-swept location on the outskirts of Cairo, it was a city of the deceased, inhabited by the living who tended to it during Menkaure's time. Giza had priests' houses, shrines, worker accommodations, stores, factories, breweries, and all the amenities of a small metropolis. The civilian life in ancient Egypt was very active. The lowest social class consisted of peasant farmers who did not own the land on which they worked on or the houses in which they resided. The monarch, members of the court, nomarchs, and priests owned the land. To begin the day, peasants would say, "Let us work for the nobility." Peasants were virtually always farmers, regardless of what other trade they practiced. They cultivated and harvested their crops, giving the majority to the landowner while keeping part for themselves. Most had private gardens, which the ladies maintained while the men worked in the fields. The lowest stratum of society created the items utilized in commerce, allowing the civilization as a whole to survive. These peasants were also part of the workforce that erected Egypt's pyramids and other monuments.
Yet, there are also revealing findings for the daily life of the workers. They were made on the west bank of the Nile, where the sun sets, and thus, according to the conceptions of the time, lies the threshold between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Here are the necropolises of the New Kingdom. The tombs in the Valley of the Queens and Kings are deeply cut into the rock at the foot of the mountain Ao Kwon, literally the horn. Since its summit has the shape of a natural pyramid, it's probably reminded the ancient Egyptians of the mythical primordial hill.